You are now listening to the Rogue Ones podcast, conversations with extraordinary people doing fascinating things that will encourage us to live with a bend toward the remarkable. The Rogue featured in this episode is an accomplished musician, but perhaps most notably, he's a heart transplant recipient whose outlook on life is full of faith and wonder. Thanks for listening today. Please enjoy. Welcome. This is Leslie Eiler Thompson, and I am host and curator of this podcast series that introduces listeners to people going rogue with stories that are quite spectacular. You might not know the folks on this show, but it's my hope that by listening to this series, you'll begin to hear the whispers of remarkable living as you interact with those around you. Today's guest is a man whose music has garnered 6 #1 albums on the Billboard charts and more than 2 billion lifetime digital streams. That's billion with a B. His music is streamed over 25 million times each month. His name is Paul Cardall, and it's his incredible story that leads his remarkable career. Paul was born with congenital heart disease, and it can be rare for babies to live very long with this condition. Paul wasn't expected to live past 24 hours, but he did. And then he wasn't expected to live past 6 months, but he did. He kept defying the doctor's predictions, and it was through these experiences that he developed a sense of purpose. This purpose has been confirmed over and over again in Paul's life, especially when he was put on the heart transplant list and waited for over a year, facing the heavy burden that in order for his life to continue, someone else's life must end. Paul views his work as a calling, and when one is called, going through the difficult circumstances and details isn't a chore. You're led by the purpose of the life to which you've been called. Paul's spiritual faith is deeply rooted and rich, and it's this belief in a higher purpose that drives his music making. You'll have the privilege of hearing a couple of his compositions as we talk about their significance in his life, and you can find links to purchase these songs online at rogueonespodcast.com. While there, you can also find a list of all episodes past and present with additional information on each guest. Please be sure to subscribe to this podcast if you enjoy yourself and share it with your friends. This is the surest way for a podcast to be shared within communities. I would be delighted and honored if you told your friends and family about this show. So now, please enjoy this conversation with Paul Cardall. How do you explain to someone who doesn't know anything about music, doesn't know anything, how do you explain to your parents, friends, what it is that you do?
You know, that's a very good question. My purpose in calling is to take all of the experiences that I continue to go through and channel that through music so that people can access spiritual feelings. So my music is I create music that is a resource to help people know that they are loved by a higher power, and they can define whatever that power is.
Where did that desire and that passion and where did that come from?
I think it stems from being born with only a half-functioning heart, being born with only half a heart, a congenital heart disease, the #1 birth defect, and
you weren't even supposed to live for
no, I
a
wasn't
year.
even supposed to live, and I had surgery in less than a day. I was 23 years old when they opened up my body to operate on my heart, and then every year I'd go see the doctor. Well, every 6 months, a year, and he'd be shocked that I was still alive and wondering why I'm able to survive with such a deformed heart. But they kept treating symptoms. I kept growing and living, but I was raised with parents who were constantly told your child is not going to live very long.
What was that like for them, do you think?
Hard.
Gosh, I would think.
Can you imagine putting your son in a crib and having to walk into your room to go to sleep, unsure?
Not knowing if when you get there the next morning, wow.
I mean, we always say our parents are crazy, but that's probably why. Because they're so worried about us.
Right.
And they always said to me, you were made for a purpose. And then you have 8 brothers and sisters. I have 8 brothers and sisters. So they're here comes the special one. Like I was wearing a helmet or something, but
You didn't have to wear a helmet, did you?
No.
Okay.
no. But often,
Were
how
you
get
treated differently? Were
yes.
they by other people? By your?
Well, you take your shirt off and you've got all these scars. And I remember as a teenager going to water parks with scars all over me, and I was insecure about it. And finally, little kids just would not stop staring at me. So I'd be like, listen, this is why you don't get into a gang.
Oh my gosh, you did not.
I did. I said, look, do you see this hole right here? This hole and this hole? Bullets. Bullets. So, but again, you use humor too with
Right.
the life and I just didn't know anything different. And I was told, you're not going to live very long.
And when did you pick up piano?
So I took piano when I was 8. I couldn't stand to take lessons. It was my great aunt. She took me down into this food storage closet that had sheet music in a big aluminum cabinet, and it was spooky.
Yeah.
So then I had to learn waltzes from the 20s, but then I realized in the 20s she was a teenager, so this is pretty hip for her. I'm like playing grunge music right now. Yeah, I hated it. I lasted 6 months. I had one recital piece, and then I didn't pick up the piano until I was a teenager. After a friend passed away, I went to the piano because he played the piano, and I just was messing around like it was a puzzle, just trying to put the pieces together. And
It's your way to connect with them.
Yes.
In a way. Wow.
Yeah. I wrote my first song. I went and played it for his parents. And then they called me back to play it for some of their friends. Mm. So that's where I was like, oh, you're not just, this isn't a sympathy, play that for me. They really wanted to hear it. They thought it was good.
And from the moment you started playing, it was for a purpose to help people.
Yeah, and ever since then, every piece of music really has been with the purpose of helping an individual, or it's drawn off an experience of somebody who taught me something really remarkable. So it's really not my music, it's the soundtrack to some of the deepest things we go through.
What happened after after your teen years and then you started doing music? What did that look like for you? Did you go to college and study music, or what happened after?
I registered for college. I went to college, but I was involved in leadership at college, and I was responsible on the Fine Arts Board, and I got involved in booking gigs for people to come to the college. And so I wasn't always in class. I was interested in hearing musicians out on the quad. So I'd organize barbecues and bring local musicians. And so that was my education. And it was great because it helped me as I was pursuing music and just playing the piano for fun. I played in a restaurant. I played in Nordstrom's. I was just doing it as a job, as for fun. I was studying film. I wanted to be a film major. And
with the goal of composing for film, or actually directing, making movies.
The thought of making money from music or film is, a college professor would tell you that's silly because it's very competitive, but no matter what you go into, you have to work to get to where you want to go. And while I was going to college, I had put out a record called The Christmas Box that was a companion to a book called The Christmas Box that came out in 1995, before most of you were born. And
who wrote the book, and how did that happen?
Richard Paul Evans wrote this book.
Okay.
And it was a CBS movie. 40 million people watched this, with Richard Thomas from the Waltons. And so there was music that accompanied the book, and he took me on tour with him. So out of college, we approached a couple record labels, and I ended up signing with Virgin Records, and that took me out of college to do 2 albums for them before I started my own record label.
You just signed with Virgin Records. I mean, how did that happen? Were you in Utah at the time?
What it is I had something of value, maybe not the music, but I had a product connected with a New York Times bestseller that had sold 10 million copies. So the label's thinking, we put this out, we're going to make, 2% of whatever that 10 million was. So we're going to sell that many. And
Sure.
yeah, we ended up doing fairly decent with the album, but then the record label with Napster and everything and an embezzlement fell apart. So there was no label. I didn't want to do smooth jazz because everything was going smooth jazz. So I just started a label that focused on purpose-driven music.
And that's Stone Angel.
Stone Angel music.
Where did that name come from?
So in the Christmas box, there was a statue called the Stone Angel in the cemetery. And that statue was put there for parents who lost a child but was never able to bury the child because of SIDS or miscarriage. And even today, there are stone angels in a lot of cemeteries throughout the country that have been put there because Rick wrote the Christmas box.
Really?
And people go there for their miscarriage, their grieving, and lay flowers for their child that never came.
Why did that become the name for your label?
Mainly because majority of the people that were writing me fan mail were talking about how the music had helped them during grief. And so there were a lot of connections, and that opened a whole world to me of other families experiencing the same scenario.
Going back to the first time you ever played music, which was for your friend's family who had just lost their son.
Yeah, and I have to thank God for everything because he just literally just said, look, you got a bad heart. I gave you a bad heart. It's beautiful. You're going to deal with it. You're going to come to me a lot. But I'm going to give you music so you can explain to everybody what you're feeling. It's like this gift he gave me of a bad heart. He says, change your heart. I took this literally.
Right, because you have a heart transplant,
I had
right?
a heart transplant.
So you were on the wait list for 385 days, is that right?
Yeah.
To get a heart. What were you doing during those days?
I kept a blog, but mainly I was in an overstuffed chair with 3 liters of oxygen going into me. I couldn't go out too many places. I had a handicap pass, which was nice because you get front row at Costco. But yeah, it's a sobering time. My daughter was 3, and all she knew was her dad wore oxygen, and she even said, I think girls wear makeup and boys wear oxygen.
Oh, my goodness.
And I had a 50-foot cord that went from my nose in the tubing all the way down the hall to where this machine was producing the oxygen. So if she needed to find me, she would just crawl on and find that, the other end of the leash. But she's just like 3-year-old, like,
Right,
what's wrong? Come on.
Yeah.
Come play with me.
Oh, my gosh.
So that was the main
was your
frustration
reality.
of it all was, I can't play with my kid, and I don't know what's going to happen.
And when did you get the call?
So I was in the hospital. I was living in a children's hospital.
The Children's Hospital.
All the experts that understood my case were pediatric because everyone that had congenital heart disease had died.
Oh, my goodness.
So I was one of the few survivors. So I was with kids.
Wow.
The day I was rejoicing in my victory over death, and all my family was in the operating room in the intensive care celebrating, there was a young girl who had been found, who had been assaulted, and they were taking care of her and getting her situation. And I knew about it because I could hear things. So how do you balance the joy of your victory over death versus someone who's now just been victimized? And so it's this even temper of emotions you go through in life.
Your victory over death meant that there was someone who was defeated by death. Do you know much about who your donor was?
I do. My donor came from Mexico. He immigrated as a kid with his mother illegally. She married a man, and the son got citizenship. But then she was deported with the family, but he stayed behind. He got involved in sports, and they were in a small mining town, so there wasn't a lot for him after high school. He either had to figure out how to get money to go to college, or there's a cartel gang, and he was starting to get kind of into that when he got overly depressed and took his life. So 3 days later, his heart is in me. And, I think about him every single day, and we couldn't find the family, but we found the stepfather, and I was able to write him a letter that was translated into Spanish, basically saying that, I will do all I can to honor his life by being a good person, by doing all I can to, represent and defend his culture and background.
And is it true that you climbed a mountain in his honor? What was it, 9 months to the day that you got the transplant, or what? How does that story go?
This podcast is getting quite depressing because while I was waiting, my brother passed, and he was finishing up his PhD.
How old was he?
He was 32. His wife was pregnant and had a daughter, and he got into an incident where, with some mental illness, and some police officers tasered him, and he died from the second taser. It was 9 months into waiting for a heart transplant. It was the day after he died where I was like, there's no way I'm going to let my mother lose 2 kids. And I kept telling the Lord, please, you can't negotiate with God, but I did everything I could to negotiate and say, come on, you cannot take both of us. And I hope you didn't take him because one of us was required or whatever, however it works.
However you reason.
So
yes,
your mindset's like, did he go because I needed to stay, or what's the deal here? But the goal was to climb a mountain called Mount Olympus that overshadowed our home growing up, and he could always climb it, and I never could. I wasn't healthy enough. But because of the mental illness he had, it led to his death. You couldn't see his illness on an x-ray, but you could see mine on an x-ray. So with his passing, it was a goal that I'm going to get my heart, and 1 year on the anniversary of his passing, we'll climb as a family in his honor and in the honor of my donor. It was 90 days later I got my call that the heart was available. They put it in me, and 6 months later, we climbed a mountain, some like 8,000 to 9,000 feet. I've done it since, and it was miserable.
Really?
But it was.
Did it feel miserable at that time, at that moment when you were doing it?
No, because you have all your family there for a purpose. I've thought about it time and time again, and it makes me realize that so many of us try to climb mountains all by ourselves. And when you do that, you're dwelling in your misery. But when you have a community with you climbing, you can laugh as you go, you can cry as you go, you can communicate and have a good time, even though you're all in misery, but you're ascending together. Because then when you get to the top, who wants to get to the top of something by themselves unless they're alone with God doing it? But
sure,
you want to be with community, you want to be with family, and you want to have something that's purpose driven.
Are you doing music during this time? And then when you do music after you've come through all of that, is it a deeply painful process to unearth these things for the purpose of other people grieving?
I couldn't do a lot of performing while I was sick, and I kept a blog. But when I was in the hospital, there was a piano down the hallway, and so after everybody would leave, they would take me down to the piano, and I could sit there for about an hour and just play what I was feeling. And I just started writing music about these emotions, and one song became called Gracie's Theme. And it's one of my most downloaded pieces of music, and it was simply about an infant that had a heart transplant but did not survive. We had the same team, and the parents of that girl that died would visit me in the hospital and encourage me to live, and it's all worth it. Everything's great. Like they had just lost their daughter.
Oh my goodness.
And they're like, you're going to survive. This is going to be awesome. And so I wrote that song, Gracie's Theme, for that family, and it since became kind of the anthem for families with congenital heart disease. So I found time to do it. But then after I was thinking, oh yeah, I've been through this crazy ordeal. I'll just come up with all this music, but it didn't come. And I'm like, what's going on? I can't write anything. I can't. And I forgot a lot of my music. I was getting really frustrated because in the intensive care, a manager came in and committed me to play these concerts, and they wanted to PR everything. And I just said, I was not in the right frame of mind. I said yes. Mm-hmm. And so within 6 months, I was playing shows. And so I needed time to heal. I think too often we get these huge miracles and then we spread ourselves thin instead of really taking a step back and going, what just happened?
You go through this massive time of physical kind of transformation almost. Now you can do things again.
Yeah.
Did that ramp up your music quite a bit? Was Stone Angel just was that a new time for Stone Angel? Was a lot happening? And I guess what year was that the transplant happened?
So I had it in 2009.
Okay.
And then 2011, I released an album called New Life. And it's a picture of me in a wheat field because it's time to harvest. And all the songs on there dealt with the emotion of facing an unknown future and then having that assurance that you're going to be around a while. So it's a very spring-oriented restoration, resurrection. There's a song in there called Life and Death, which is based on a theme from Michael Giacchino that he wrote for a show called Lost.
It's a little old thing.
The theme was so beautiful. It was only a 30-second theme that I took it and I elaborated on it. And Life and Death has become my most downloaded piece of music across every border of culture and faith, and Muslims and Buddhist and Judaism, and people just all over connect with the melody and find something spiritual in it.
We'll return to my conversation with Paul Cardall in just a moment. If you've been enjoying this show, you can dive deeper into the Rogue Ones podcast world by spending some time at rogueonespodcast.com. Not only can you find a full listing of episodes, but you can join the email community, listen to the Rogue One Spotify playlist with songs compiled by listeners, and you can even get Rogue merch like hats and mugs. That's all online at rogueonespodcast.com. Now, back to my conversation with Paul Cardall. And you're doing all the administration of all of this at this point, right?
Yeah.
What did that, a lot of people that listen to this podcast, they're interested in the multifaceted person who's not only created the thing, but is administrating it as well, who is actively going to the meetings and doing the thing. What is that like for you? How did you, I know now some of those things have been delegated to other people, but can you speak to that a little bit? How do you focus on the things you need to focus on, and how do you do the things well?
Well, I lived in the Wild West. I was out there in Utah, and I didn't know too many people in the music industry, so all I did was focus on what I had. But I read Billboard magazine, and I read everything that was happening with the music, and so I was aware of Pandora and Spotify and all the streaming, the internet, and all this stuff. And I remember early on how much it would cost to design a website, and I was like, well, it's probably cheaper if I just go learn it. So I went and I learned how to design a website. I learned graphic design. I learned how to do video editing, how to make videos, how to do album artwork. And so Stone Angel Music really is me and my wife for the last 20 years, kind of doing everything. I did all the PR. I couldn't even find a publicist.
That's amazing.
Nobody had interest in piano music. It's like,
really?
You can stream. I've got 2 billion streams, and yet who do you get to They can't explain it. They're all asking, how did you pull it off? But at the same time, it's like, well, I don't know. You just survive and adapt and you do it. And
how do you keep from getting overwhelmed by everything that was in front of you?
Because when you get an email from somebody who says, my mother passed away listening to Life and Death.
Oh, goodness.
And it brought peace into our room. I knew, because it's a calling.
And from the moment you started playing, it was for a purpose to help people.
Yeah, every piece of music really has been with the purpose of helping an individual, or it's drawn off an experience of somebody who taught me something really remarkable. So it's really not my music, it's the soundtrack to some of the deepest things we go through. But there's a lot of hope in the music, even though it's melancholy.
It's melancholy, but to get people into a mind space, a space where they can start thinking about what does all of this mean in the grander scheme of life.
But there's also this feeling that is like a warm blanket being wrapped around you, and there's no words to explain it. But music can create a situation where the type of music I do, it's very intimate. God says, go into your closets to pray. That means nobody's in there. You're worshiping all by yourself. It's you and him. The goal of the music has always been to provide those intimate moments. It's been very clear to me from day one what my job is on earth. And so it takes time to kind of explain it and delegate it. And I know that we could get a lot further if I had a whole bunch of people involved. But my listeners are the ones that are doing the work, because they're the ones that are sharing it. They're the ones that see it for what it is, and it just multiplies. But now, since I moved to Nashville, got a lot of people that are aware of it and how we built it, and are anxious to expose it to even more parts of the world.
What qualities do you think were built up in yourself and in your character from all your experiences that made you able to live a life of this sort of extraordinary, remarkable?
Those are very good questions, because why are certain people able to do certain things? And I think I had to grow up fast, because I was told, you probably won't live to adulthood. You probably might not live through the year. You probably not survive this surgery. So I was constantly thinking about the afterlife, and that's my retirement. So people save for retirement, but I was trying to figure out everything I needed to do in preparation to go to the other side. And much of it was like, Lord, I remember when you were talking to Peter and James and John and the guys, and you were like, well, where do you guys want to go when I'm gone? And Peter and James were like, well, dude, I'm coming with you. Mm-hmm. And John was quiet. And he said, well, John, what about you? He's like, I kind of would like to stay and preach until you come back. Mm-hmm. And I was always telling the Lord throughout my childhood, I'm John. I'm John. I'd like to stay and work here for your purpose, and then take me whenever you want.
The last question I like to ask my guests is, for someone who's also looking to live a life of extraordinary measures, what's the best piece of advice you can give?
I heard Tom Jackson, who produces concerts, he said, you need to ask yourself this question. Are you driven, or are you being led? And if you can answer the second one, you're more likely to succeed. Because when you're driven, you kind of like plow through things, and people's emotions aren't as valuable. But when you're led, you've acknowledged that you're not driving the car. So it's much easier to recorrect. And I don't even think you have to really take much deep meditation on, okay, God, where am I supposed to go now? I think it's just a matter of impressions. Does this feel right? Mm-hmm. is this going to hurt anybody? Is this going to help anybody? And if you know it's going to help somebody, then you do it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the key to living an extraordinary life.
Paul's life story is heavy. When we talked, tears began to fill my eyes as the realization of the depth of his circumstances rushed over me. To have another person's heart for your own is nearly impossible to comprehend, but then to celebrate the new life you've been given at the cost of someone else's is a deeply confounding idea that's difficult to understand. So, thank you for joining us in this difficult conversation, my friend, and it was a pleasure to tell his story. Until next time, we'll talk soon.